The repossession notice was stapled to my windshield, right under the wiper, flapping in the wind off Lake Erie like it wanted everyone on the street to see it before I did. 14 days. That's what the letter said. 14 days before the bank took the only thing I had left that still ran, still moved, still meant I could get to job interviews instead of sitting in my apartment waiting for the world to forget about me. My name is Jordan Maxwell, and 3 months before that morning, I had a job I actually liked. I worked logistics for a mid-sized furniture distributor on the east side of Cleveland, the kind of job nobody dreams about as a kid, but that pays for a one-bedroom and a used Honda and the occasional dinner out. Then the company lost its biggest contract, and within 6 weeks half the warehouse staff and most of the office got letters telling us our positions were no longer necessary. Mine was one of them. I remember standing in the parking lot afterward holding a cardboard box with a desk plant in it, thinking it was almost funny how little they gave you to carry out the door. I tried not to panic at first. I had some savings, not much, but enough to feel like I had a cushion. I told myself I'd find something in a month, maybe 6 weeks. I updated my resume that same night, applied to 9 places before I went to bed. I was optimistic in the way you can only be optimistic when you haven't been turned down yet. The turning down came fast. Warehouse manager positions wanted 5 years of supervisory experience I didn't have. Logistics coordinator roles wanted a degree I didn't have. Entry-level jobs looked at my resume and decided I was overqualified, which felt like a cruel kind of joke, being told I was too experienced to get hired anywhere. By the second month, my cushion was gone. By the third, I was choosing between my phone bill and groceries some weeks, and the car payment, the one thing I couldn't let slide, because without the car, I couldn't get to the few interviews I was still landing, started falling behind. I called the finance company twice to explain. The first time, a woman named someone in customer service told me there was a hardship program, but I needed 3 pay stubs to qualify, and I didn't have 3 pay stubs to give her. The second call ended with a recorded message saying my account had been flagged for review. The letter came 9 days after that. I live in a small apartment complex on the edge of Lakewood, the kind of place with a courtyard nobody sits in and a landlord who communicates mostly through typed notices taped to doors. My car was parked in the side lot, the one closest to the building manager's unit, which is probably why she saw the notice before I even got back out there that morning. Her name is Margaret Calloway, and she's run that complex for almost 11 years. She's somewhere in her early 60s, gray hair always pulled back. The kind of woman who remembers which apartment had a leaky faucet last spring and which one's been late on rent twice. I'd talked to her maybe a dozen times in the 2 years I'd lived there, mostly about maintenance requests, mostly brief. I didn't think she knew anything about my life beyond the unit number on my lease. If you believe people can still surprise you with kindness when you least expect it, take a second to like this video and share it with someone who could use a reminder today. Stories like this only matter if they reach the people who need them. I didn't tell anyone about the repossession notice. Not my sister in Columbus, not the 2 friends I still talk to regularly. Shame has a way of making you quiet exactly when you need to be loud. I went back inside, sat on the edge of my bed and stared at that piece of paper until the words stopped meaning anything. 14 days. I did the math over and over, like maybe if I added it up differently, the number would change. The next week was the worst stretch I'd had since losing the job. I picked up 2 days of work through a temp staffing agency, loading trucks at a distribution center 40 minutes away, which meant I needed the car even more, which made the whole thing feel like a trap closing slowly. I started parking it 2 blocks away at night, out of some irrational hope that distance would keep it safe, even though I knew that wasn't how repossession worked. I barely slept. I'd lie there running numbers that never balanced, no matter how many times I rearranged them. By day 9, I'd started looking into whether I could sell the car myself before they took it, just to walk away with something instead of nothing. I called 2 dealerships about trade-in value. Both offered me less than what I owed. That afternoon, there was a knock at my door. Soft, almost apologetic, nothing like the brisk double knock the maintenance guy usually gave. When I opened it, Margaret Calloway was standing in the hallway with a clipboard against her chest and an expression I couldn't quite place, somewhere between concern and curiosity. I assumed it was about something with the apartment. A noise complaint, a late fee, something administrative. My stomach dropped anyway, because lately every knock on a door felt like bad news waiting to happen. She asked if she could come in for a minute. I stepped back and let her, and she looked around briefly, not in a judgmental way, just taking in the room. There wasn't much to see. A mattress on a frame, a folding table I used as a desk, a stack of unopened mail I'd been avoiding because I already knew what was in most of it. She told me she'd noticed my car hadn't moved from its usual spot in almost a week, and that when she walked past it yesterday, she saw the notice through the windshield before I'd taken it down. She said she wasn't trying to pry, but she'd been doing this job long enough to recognize what it looks like when someone's quietly falling apart. I felt my face get hot. Pride is a strange thing to hold on to when you're 3 weeks from sleeping in a car that won't be yours much longer, but I held on to it anyway, at least for the first few seconds. Then something about the way she just waited, patient, not pushing, made the whole story come out almost on its own. The layoff, the applications, the temp work, the phone calls to the finance company that went nowhere. I hadn't said any of it out loud to another person in 3 months, and once I started, it was hard to stop. When I finished, she didn't say anything right away. She just nodded slowly, like she'd been putting pieces together while I talked, and they'd finally clicked into place. Then she told me something I never expected to hear from my landlord. Before she managed apartment complexes, Margaret had spent almost 15 years running a job placement nonprofit out of a strip mall in Parma, helping people coming out of layoffs, out of prison, out of long stretches of unemployment find their footing again. She'd closed it down when her husband got sick, and after he passed, she took the property management job because it was steady, and she didn't have the energy left to run a nonprofit on her own anymore. But she said something had been sitting with her for a while, an itch she hadn't scratched, about starting something again, smaller this time, but real. Then she made the offer. She said she'd call the apartment complex's owner, who she had a long relationship with, and ask him to let me defer rent for 2 months while I got back on my feet. That part alone would have been more than I could have asked for, but she said there was a condition, and it wasn't really a condition so much as a request. She wanted me to help her get a small resource program started, something based out of the complex's empty community room, 2 evenings a week, helping other tenants and neighborhood folks with resumes, job applications, interview prep, anything she remembered from her nonprofit days that people kept asking her about informally anyway. I asked her, kind of stunned, why me? I told her I barely had my own life together. I wasn't exactly a success story to point to. She said that was exactly the point. She told me people trust advice more when it comes from someone who's actually been in the hole, not someone reading off a script. She said the best help she'd ever given people, back when she ran her nonprofit, came from former clients who turned around and started helping the next person in line. I said yes before I'd even fully thought it through. The next few weeks felt like waking up into a different version of my life. I still didn't have a job. The car situation was still hanging over me even with the deferral. But for the first time in months, I had somewhere to be that wasn't a waiting room or a job board. Margaret and I cleared out the community room, which had mostly been used for storing broken patio furniture, and turned it into something resembling an actual workspace. We borrowed 2 folding tables from the leasing office, set up an old desktop computer someone in the building had donated, and put a handwritten sign on the door that just said, "Resource hours, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 6 to 8. The first night, nobody came. The second night, one person showed up, a guy named Felix who lived 2 floors above me and had been laid off from a warehouse job around the same time I had. We worked on his resume together for almost 2 hours. By the 3rd week, word had spread through the complex and a few neighboring buildings, and we had people lined up at the door some nights. A single mother trying to get back into nursing after a 5-year gap raising her kids, a guy in his 50s who'd worked the same factory job for 22 years before it closed, and didn't know how to write a resume because he'd never needed one. A 19-year-old trying to figure out community college applications because nobody at home could help him with it. Every person who walked through that door reminded me of where I'd been 3 weeks earlier, sitting on my bed staring at a repossession. Notice like it might rearrange itself into something less terrifying if I looked long enough. And every time someone left with a plan, even a small one, something in me started to settle that hadn't settled in months. About 6 weeks into running the program, a man named Desmond Okafor came in one Thursday evening. He managed regional operations for a freight and logistics company headquartered out in Independence, and he'd heard about our little program through his cousin, who lived in the building and had stopped by for help with a cover letter the week before. Desmond wasn't there for himself. He'd come to drop off a box of donated office supplies, a few old laptops his company was decommissioning, things like that. While we were carrying boxes in from his truck, we got to talking, the way people do when they're doing something physical together, and the conversation just happens without either person trying too hard. I mentioned my background in furniture logistics, the job I'd lost, the kind of work I used to do. He stopped what he was doing and looked at me differently. He said his company had just opened up a regional coordinator position, almost exactly the kind of work I'd been doing before, and that they'd been struggling to fill it because most applicants either lacked the warehouse floor experiences or the planning side, and I apparently had both. He asked if I'd be interested in coming in for an interview. I tried to play it cool in the moment, but I remember walking back into my apartment that night and just standing in the middle of the room for a second, not really believing it. 3 days later, I interviewed with their operations director. A week after that, I had an offer letter in my inbox, full-time benefits, a salary that was actually better than what I'd been making before the layoff. I sat in my car, the same car that had nearly been repossessed 2 months earlier, and read that offer letter probably 6 times before I trusted it was real. The resource program kept going even after I started the new job. I cut back to 1 evening a week instead of 2, but I didn't stop, because by then it wasn't just something I was doing for Margaret anymore. It had become the thing that made the worst 3 months of my life feel like they'd actually been for something. Before I get to how things turned out, I want to ask you something. If you've ever had a moment where a stranger, or someone you barely knew, did something that completely changed the direction your life was heading, tell me about it in the comments. Where you're watching from, and what that moment was. I read every single one, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. It's been a little over 2 years now since that knock on my door. The resource program, which we eventually started calling the Callaway Career Room, has expanded into 2 other apartment complexes managed by the same ownership group, and between the 3 locations, it's helped close to 800 people get back to work, write their first resume, or figure out a next step they couldn't see on their own. Margaret still runs the overall program, but she brought on 2 part-time coordinators last year, both of whom came through the program themselves first. I still think about that morning with the notice on my windshield, how certain I was that it marked the beginning of the end of something. It turned out to be the opposite. It was the moment someone looked past the surface of my situation and decided I was worth investing in, not because I'd earned it or proven myself, but because she recognized what it looks like when a person is quietly drowning and chose to do something about it instead of looking away. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs a reason to believe people are still capable of this kind of generosity, and subscribe for more stories like it, because sometimes the moment that feels like everything falling apart is actually the quiet beginning of something you never could have built on your own.